joining us this evening. We will begin in just a few moments. Tonight, throughout our discussion, if you have any questions for the panelists, please email questions@ag.ny.gov. To repeat, that email is questions@ag.ny.gov. It's also written on the bottom of the screen. Again, thank you all for joining us, and it is now my pleasure to introduce a woman who really needs no introduction, our Attorney General, Latisha James.
Thank you, Ty, and good evening. I want to thank everyone for tuning in tonight. And while the subject of tonight's conversation is serious, I look forward to what I am confident will be an informative and educational event. The purpose of our meeting is as follows. On Friday, my office secured an indictment against an individual whose name is Paul Alexander. The investigation into Mr. Alexander, who is being charged with several counts of sex trafficking of a child and related crimes, was the result of a long-term investigation between my office and NYPD. And I want to thank the men and women of NYPD. An investigation that started only because of the bravery of some young girls. Let me repeat that. It was the bravery of young girls who brought us to this point and who reported Mr. Alexander's actions. We are also grateful to the Bronx District Attorney's Office under the leadership of DA Darcel Clark for their support as well. Mr. Alexander is charged with sexually abusing young girls and selling sex with young girls to other men. He lured these girls into his apartment in the Bronx with food and drugs. And so many people were surprised that this was happening in New York City, in a New York City apartment building, in the middle of everyday life. Not in the early in the hours after midnight, but during business hours, every day, around the clock. He was luring these girls into his apartment. But unfortunately, young girls are being trafficked all around the city of New York. And individuals know, but individuals are afraid to report these incidents to my office and or to the district attorney of the Bronx or any other county in the city of New York and or the state of New York. But they should. They should also notify all of the advocates who are here this afternoon, because it is our collective responsibility to protect these young girls and to go after individuals like Paul Alexander and hold them accountable and even prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. And so that means arresting and charging and calling out traffickers. But it also means building community support for young people and educating our communities and our neighbors on how to spot trafficking and what to do if you suspect it is happening in your building, on your block, in your neighborhood, in your home, anywhere. And today I'm honored that we are joined by some of the most prominent advocates who work on this issue each and every day, and who will share with us how we can all work together to end sex trafficking of children. Children. And we have representatives here tonight from Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, Girls for Gender Equity, Not on My Watch, Safe Horizon, Steps to End Family Violence, and Sanctuary for Families. We are also joined here by the great borough president of the Bronx, Ruben Diaz Jr. But at this point in time, and before we get to our panel, it is my honor and my privilege to introduce my friend, the great Bronx County District Attorney Darcel Clark.
Thank you so much, Attorney General James. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for your partnership. Thank you for being the highest ranking law enforcement officer in this state and recognizing us here in our little corner of the Bronx to know that we have issues that devastate our community and our young people, our young girls who need our help and protection. Thank you for recognizing that and partnering with NYPD to get rid of the scourge of human trafficking that we have here in the Bronx. This is an issue that has been plaguing this community for a very long time. And being the Bronx District Attorney, it's my privilege to make sure that I do everything that I can to make the community safe for our young women, for our young people. I want to thank the borough president of the Bronx, Ruben Diaz Jr., who's always been a partner in this to make sure, again, that what we need in our borough comes to our borough. And he has also made resources available and just getting the word out on what we need to have done. So I thank him for that. And all of the advocates that are here. There's so many of you, the panelists that I know personally, either as being the DA, some of you have worked in my office, some I've worked with when I was a judge, etc. You keep our feet to the fire. Just as we have to hold these sex traffickers accountable, you have to hold us accountable as the elected officials responsible for making sure that we keep our communities safe. A special shout out again to Reverend Q English, who we have been shoulder to shoulder on this. I have been with her. She does not make it a secret that not on my watch is real and that we need to make sure that this doesn't happen on any of our watch. So we will continue to work with her, with the NYPD, with so many elected officials. I see Council Member Vanessa Gibson is here as well. We're going to do all that we can to continue to get rid of this. I started a human trafficking unit because it was that important. So we were happy to work with Attorney General James during this investigation. I have dedicated assistant DAs that work on this. I, unlike a lot of other DA's office, not only have a human trafficking unit, but I have a social worker assigned to this particular unit to work with this population to make sure that they're right. And I stand by what I say by not charging prostitution and loitering. And I stood side by side with the advocates to make sure that the laws got changed, but also I did more. I went into court and I dismissed those cases that were still pending in those areas, but we haven't charged them in a long time. So I've always seen this now as a victim-centered crime as opposed to a defendant-centered crime, meaning I'm not charging the young women, we're going after those who are trafficking them. So I look forward to this panel this evening. I know it's going to be informative, and anything that the Bronx DA's office to do can be helpful in moving this agenda forward to make sure we continue to make our communities safe for our young women and our young people who are sex workers and in human trafficking. I am here to serve. Thank you very much. As I told some of them on this call earlier, I'm not new to this, I'm true to this. So we're going to make sure we continue to do this work. Thank you.
Thank you, DA Clark, for those remarks. Our next speaker is a son of the Bronx who first entered public office as a member of the New York State Assembly in 1997 and is currently serving his third full term as Bronx Borough President. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Ruben Diaz Jr.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for that introduction, Ms. Johnson. To all of those that are viewing, welcome, albeit virtually, to the Boogie Down Bronx. I just want to echo the sentiments of our District Attorney, Darcel Clark, and really thanking all of the advocates for the work that you do on a daily basis. The fact is that and as I said this earlier, it matters who's in office, and the fact that all of you, in one way, shape, or form, through your advocacy, either dealing with individuals or dealing with the topics and legislators, you have really brought about change. You brought about change with making sure that you passed the Safe Harbor Act of 2008. You brought change by bringing it to my attention, such as individuals like Reverend Q English. You have brought change by making sure that we have the right people in office. And when you speak of our Attorney General, Latisha James, and our Bronx District Attorney, Darcel Clark, again, let this be a real civic lesson that, and it's so evident that while we have to deal with so much in our borough, so much, there's so many different issues, and Vanessa Gibson knows this, that this is an issue that unfortunately too many people did not pay attention to. And Q English and so many of you have really brought this to the forefront and make sure that we just don't sweep this under the rug. But with this task force, our Attorney General and our District Attorney and the NYPD, now you're putting the focus where it really belongs. And that's to the culprits, to those individuals like this guy, Alexander. I don't even want to, that's all I have to say about him. And make sure that he gets prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, but also making sure that those who were portrayed as the culprits, as the criminals in the past, our babies, our victims, are now treated accordingly and are being given proper services, and making sure that they go to agencies, that they go to family court, that they give in the support system, so they can, as best they can, live a better life moving forward after all the trauma, after all of the harm and the pain that they've experienced. So, and then the last thing I just want to say is this: for those who are watching, look at the panelists and look at the individuals that you see here. They're predominantly women. Men, we have to step up when it comes to sex trafficking. Men, we have to talk about this. Men, we have to make sure that we don't trivialize this conversation, that we're not dismissive about this conversation. I am a brother of a sister. I'm a son of a mother. I'm a husband to a wife. I'm a tío to nieces. And I hope one day to be a grandfather to a granddaughter, even though my sons aren't cooperating anytime soon. The point is that women are very much a part of my life, and they're part of all the men's life, right? And so men have to be just as vocal as the women are on this conversation. And as a man, as a as a Bronxite, I'm so happy. I'm glad, not happy. I wish we didn't have to have it, but I'm glad that this conversation is happening, and I want to make sure that we get more men involved in this. So thank you all, and have a great conversation. And I'm sure it's going to be a fruitful and powerful exchange tonight.
Thank you, Borough President Diaz, for those remarks. The next speaker we will hear from represents the West Bronx in the 16th Council District, where she passionately advocates for affordable housing, low-income families, seniors, LGBTQ rights, gender equity, and much more. Ladies and gentlemen, Council Member Vanessa Gibson.
Thank you so much, Ms. Johnson, and good evening, everyone. It's really an honor and privilege to be with all of you. Thank you so much. I am New York City Council Member Vanessa Gibson, and I'm proud to serve District 16 in the West Bronx, and I'm equally as proud to serve as co-chair of the New York City Council Women's Caucus. The Women's Caucus is a membership of 13 women that advocate for gender equity, pay parity, and all issues that are important to our women and young girls across the city of New York. I thank you all for joining us tonight. I want to especially thank our New York State Attorney General, Latisha James, the Office of the Attorney General's Organized Crime Task Force, and the New York City Police Department's Vice Major Case Squad, the Human Trafficking Team, and everyone involved, the Bronx District Attorney's Office, for all of your work in arresting and charging this Mr. Alexander in December of last year. Earlier this month, it was announced that Mr. Alexander was indicted on multiple counts of sex trafficking of a child. Our streets and our children are now a little bit safer. Thank you, Madam Attorney General, Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark, and our Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr. Thank you all for your leadership, your compassion, and your conviction in making sure that at the end of the day, we work together collectively to protect our young girls so they know that their circumstance does not determine their future. Earlier this year, the Women's Caucus was very proud to host a briefing in partnership with Safe Horizon, Womankind, Restore New York City, the Legal Aid Society on human trafficking and how the City Council can support our survivors and bring more awareness to this important issue. Last year, my colleague and my co-chair in the City Council, Farrah Lewis, we introduced legislation in the City Council to amend the administrative code of the City of New York in relation to requiring the police department to report on missing persons, some of which are missing as a result of human trafficking. We don't often talk about the young girls who are missing, and we have to recognize that those girls deserve our attention, our love, and our support. Earlier today, Mayor de Blasio announced that the NYPD will review its policies and procedures for identifying and investigating human trafficking to develop alternative methods that will focus on arresting traffickers without further criminalizing and harming those directly involved in the sex trade, and to address the racialized enforcement of sex work. This is part of the city's effort to ensure that traffickers are punished and survivors are not double victimized, but are supported. Women of color, immigrants, our LGBTQIA+ community, runaway and homeless youth, and so many other vulnerable groups are disproportionately targeted for sex and labor trafficking at alarming rates. We see those numbers and we know the faces of those statistics. They expect people to not report them as missing, or for authorities and elected officials and advocates not to care. But you know what? We do care, and we will take all of us working together. It will take every single one of us working together to put traffickers behind bars, to send a message that you will not traffic our young girls, our young princesses and young queens that deserve better, that deserve support and resources and encouragement and motivation. If anyone out there suspects someone who might be a victim of trafficking, please contact one of our incredible providers that are on the front lines doing this work every single day, during a pandemic and not during a pandemic, to keep our children and their families safe. I want to thank all of our providers, Sanctuary for Families, Safe Horizon, Girls for Gender Equity, Steps to End Family Violence, Not on My Watch, Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. Thank you all for joining us today and for being incredible partners in this fight. Unfortunately, the fight is not over, but we will continue to fight on and press on until we no longer have to worry about our young girls being trafficked by anyone in this city and in our communities and in this country. Thank you again, everyone. I look forward to tonight's fruitful and productive conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilmember Gibson. Our next speaker is Ms. Priscilla Tavares. Priscilla is the Crime Victims Assistance Coordinator in the Office of the Attorney General. In that role, she provides victims and their families assistance with emotional support and supportive services. Priscilla?
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Priscilla Tavares, and I'm the Crime Victims Assistance Coordinator for the New York State Office of the Attorney General. Sex trafficking is a major and very important issue in today's society, which is why it's very important to have community awareness, or to make community awareness. Each year, many youths fall victims to such horrendous crime. It is important to have these community discussions to make our community aware of what is sex trafficking, red flags and or indicators to look for, and to make them knowledgeable about the resources that are available to assist victims and their families in our community. Victims often aren't aware of all the services and assistance that are available to them, as they're often too scared to come forth or hesitant to receive any kind of services, for many different reasons, including not limited to fear of retaliation if there is an issue or with immigration status, distrust sometimes of law enforcement, and fear of retaliation against their families, whether it's domestic or abroad. So at the New York State Attorney General's office, we provide assistance with advocacy, supportive services, and safety planning, amongst other services to victims and their families through direct and follow-up services. We also assist victims and their families by guiding them and providing them with emotional support through the criminal justice process, at which times could be very traumatizing for the victim, as they feel that sometimes they have to relive their traumatizing experiences. Often victims and their families are also referred and connected to appropriate agencies, as the agencies that are participating today, and resources within our community that specialize in extensive comprehensive services, which entails therapeutic services, housing assistance, amongst other things. If you know of a victim and or family members that are in need of supportive services and guidance, you could always feel free to reach out to our office for further assistance. And remember that together we can make a difference.
Thank you, Ms. Taveras. The next person that we will hear from will be our moderator for the evening, Ms. Megan Fox, who is the Chief Deputy Attorney General for Social Justice. Prior to starting in the office of the OAG, she spent her career in legal services in New York City and Brooklyn, where she focused on financial justice, fair housing, and family law matters. Megan?
Thank you so much, Ty, and thank you, Attorney General James, for bringing us together this evening. I'm going to just briefly introduce our panel, and then we can get started with the conversation. We have with us this evening Anna Thomas, who is a counselor at the Justice and Empowerment for Teens Initiative at Sanctuary for Families, and Anita Tika, Senior Director of the Anti-Trafficking Program at Safe Horizon, Michelle Greer, who is the Chief Program Officer at Girls for Gender Equity, Ann Patterson, Senior Vice President for Steps to End Family Violence Program at Rising Ground. We have Reverend Q English, founder and CEO of Not on My Watch, and Taina Bien Ami, Executive Director for the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. Thank you all for being with us this evening. I want to start off first with a question for Anita and Anna. Can you just tell us the definition of sex trafficking and how it might differ from prostitution?
Sure, I'm happy to go first, and then Anna can kick it over to you if you like. So for sex trafficking, there previously were, there are two definitions actually, depending on the age group of the victim that we're talking about. So for sex trafficking of an adult, you need to have force or fraud or coercion after you've obtained or procured or enticed or groomed or recruited an individual to engage in any type of commercial sexual activity. So this is any type of sexual activity in exchange for anything of value. It doesn't have to be money, but it can be food or clothing, shelter, it can be a phone or a Metro card. We've seen any number of exchanges. Under federal law, though, minors, so anyone under the age of 18, as long as they were engaging in any type of commercial sexual activity, they were automatically considered victims of sex trafficking. And so in 2018, New York State changed their law to be in line with federal law, such that now under New York State law, if you are under the age of 18 and you're engaging in commercial sexual activity, you're automatically considered a victim of child sex trafficking. Anna, do you have anything that you wanted to round out there?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, that was a great overview. I would also like to add that according to the federal definition, which is defined by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, sex trafficking means the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, or patronizing of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. So that's a mouthful, but basically, according to the federal law, any individual of any age who is bought or sold by the commercial sex trade meets the federal definition. However, in order to obtain a criminal penalty or to qualify for, let's say, a T visa, an adult would have to meet the definition of severe forms of sex trafficking, which is a distinction from general sex trafficking, and they would have to meet the elements of force, fraud, and coercion.
Okay. Thank you very much. So turning to Michelle and Reverend Q, could you talk about who is vulnerable to being trafficked?
Michelle, do you want me to start and then throw it to you?
Yes, that's great.
Okay.
That's great.
Okay, so we know that no community, whether affluent or impoverished, is immune to the crime of human trafficking. So while there isn't one face of a human trafficking victim, certain populations are more vulnerable. So that includes runaway, homeless youth, children and youth in foster care, individuals fleeing violence, individuals with a disability, those who have suffered other types of abuse or exploitation in their lifetimes. So also minors in the child welfare system there was a study done, are significantly more likely to be trafficked than their peers who have had no contact with the child welfare system. We're also looking at as I said earlier, the homeless runaway youth are another common target for traffickers, where you find them approached at transportation hubs, shelters, or other public spaces. Foreign nationals are at an increased risk because of the legal and travel restrictions they face. Individuals with a history of trauma or abuse are less resilient and more susceptible to human trafficking. We see intimate partner violence, domestic violence, incest, psychological or emotional abuse or neglect, and other forms of trauma and violence can make a person more vulnerable to human trafficking. I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Thank you. So definitely agree with everything that you named. And also what we see with our young people, understanding the racialized history of this country, is that you have young people who are experiencing an increase of being pushed out of the systems that are supposed to be supporting them. And so they are also at risk. So we're talking about Black and brown girls, we're talking about trans and cis and gender nonconforming young people, that when they're coming into these spaces and constantly being removed for how they present in those spaces or over sexualized within places that we might consider protective factors, schools, social service agencies, other places, that then when they are removed from those spaces and community, then they are also at risk.
And Michelle, can you tell us about sort of who is involved in trafficking young people and sort of what methods they use to recruit young people?
It's so interesting. I was following up with my mother today because she was like, what are you going to be talking about today? And she was like, do you mean people in our community? When I was having this conversation, I think a lot of times people think sex traffickers or people who are involved in causing harm to folks are outside of community. And we need to start recognizing and talking about the people who are sitting next to us, our neighbors, other folks who are directly in work with us. So if we are talking about the guy who's on the corner who might know everyone, who's able to buy you a Coke or get you that MetroCard as referred to earlier, we're talking about potentially leaders within community that have access and maybe aren't challenged as much. And I just want to name that there's not one face of who we are talking about when we're saying those who are causing this harm and bringing folks into sex trafficking. And what we need to start then doing is having more accountability and looking inward and recognizing what that can look like. And so we then name that as coercion, you being forced into something because maybe you got caught up needing to pay for things, needing access to things, being shown love and support where maybe you weren't getting it through these other ways. And so back to the reference of, you know, MetroCards are huge in the city. You need to get around, you need to get to school, you want to hang out with your friends. And also folks disconnecting from friends and from community. So then this person becomes your community, your friends, and the emotional connection that then is built through that. You're the only one who actually understands me or hears me. So there's not one composite. I want to continue to name that. It's not just what you see on TV. And that's why oftentimes I think folks become so surprised or don't want to recognize it and tease that out.
Okay, thank you. And Reverend Q, could you add a little bit more about sort of what methods traffickers use to recruit people?
I was just going to say, they're master manipulators. They're master manipulators. They will take their time in the grooming process. And a lot of times when these children are being trafficked, they don't even realize they're being trafficked. You know, a lot of them are looking for that next meal. They're looking for that warm bed. They're looking for that comfort. They're looking for that father figure that was absent in their lives. But one of the things that is really hard to pinpoint, people think they're back in the day, it was, Papa was a Rolling Stone look, with the top hat and the polyester suits, but it's not that today. It's anyone and everyone is in this space. And even when you think about it, you think that even our gang, the folks that are involved in the gang life, they are choosing to do more in this space of trafficking. Why? Because drugs, you sell it one time and that's it, but a human body you can sell multiple times in one day. So the trafficker could be anyone, but the number one thing you need to realize is that they are manipulators. They are manipulators and they will lure girls into this life without them even knowing they're in the life.
And we know we've heard a bit about the physical abuse, but what other methods are used by traffickers to control victims?
Just want to underscore everything that has already been said by everyone, and really emphasize some things that Reverend English is talking about, that people who choose to traffic other people absolutely engage in behavior that's tremendously manipulative. And just as Michelle talks about there being a diversity among people who experience trafficking, there is a diversity among people who facilitate trafficking. And I think some of the most complex aspects of the relationship between someone who has been trafficked and someone who is facilitating that trafficking is that person also may have a capacity for tremendous tenderness. They may have the capacity to show this person love, stability. They may be able to offer them ease and comfort. And we are all deeply relational creatures. And when we are in relationship with someone that is able to show us tenderness and comfort, even though they're matching that with manipulation and terror, that can be especially complex for anyone trying to survive and negotiate that. So I think that clinically, we talk about that as the trapping nature of what's called intermittent reward, when someone demonstrates tremendous tenderness towards you and then matches that with real terrifying behavior. So I think that's a very effective strategy that each and every one of us are susceptible to, that to be sort of in that bind of a relationship with someone who is terrifying and tender, and often all at the same time.
Tayana, can you tell us what some common myths that we hear about sex trafficking that we should know about?
Sure. And first, I'd like to thank everyone, AG James and Councilwoman and DA. This is such an honor to be here, and especially my colleagues. Thank you so much. I would say there are many myths about sex trafficking. And I think that my colleagues here have tried to undo sort of some of the myths already. I would say one of the main ones is that sex trafficking requires movement. It does not. I think if you go on the street and you ask an average person, what is human trafficking? They'll think about the person who's locked in a basement, tied to a radiator, who comes from a foreign country, probably Asia or Latin America. But again, I think the way we are describing what a trafficker does and the means that he or she uses, it really is about abuse of power and abuse of vulnerability. And there are many, many means which were just listed that lure, coerce, or entice, induce someone into a situation of exploitation. The other myth or I would say it's not really a myth, but it's a question of education, is what is sex trafficking? Like, we have not had one conversation about the market of sex trafficking. So the way I sometimes explain it to people, that sex trafficking is like a vehicle. It's like a train through which a perpetrator or a trafficker brings their victims to an end destination. In labor trafficking, that end destination can be nail salons or restaurants or factories. In sex trafficking, that end destination is the sex trade, which is a number of different manifestations of commercial sexual exploitation. But the one glue, this is again a market of supply, demand, and an incentive for profit. And while it is absolutely key to target traffickers, right? We need strong laws to do that. He would not have been charged for trafficking if there hadn't been a market for the demand for those bodies, right? And so it's very important to say, yeah, he did lure those girls. He did exploit them. He probably sexually assaulted them, raped them, did horrific things to them. But those would have been under different laws than sex trafficking. What makes him a sex trafficker is that he delivered them to sex buyers. And without them, there would be no market of sex trafficking. And I think that's probably the key takeaway for people on the street to understand.
Good. Thank you. I want to turn now to talking about prevention. So just Michelle and then maybe Anna, could you talk about sort of how we might identify at-risk youth, and then what is the best way for us to respond if we do encounter someone who is a victim or survivor of trafficking?
Yeah. So I do want to say that one of the best forms of prevention, we talked about this, like young people not even having the language or knowing what's happening. So having holistic sexuality education is a huge preventative measure for so many different issues and factors. And then when we look at young people, it's being able to ask those questions and listen to their experiences. So there's so much shame that prevails around what goes on within these moments, and giving young people the space and the chances to do that. So that requires then creating space where they will come forward, and where you can actually promote those conversations. Oftentimes the spaces that are created for young people don't do that. At GG, we spend a lot of time in community, opening up using relational tools. So sitting in circles, being able to have them lead in the education, telling us about their experiences so that then they can start to come forward and ask questions like, is this okay? What do you think about this relationship? Does it sound like I have a healthy boyfriend? Those sort of things, and not shying away from that. And oftentimes when adults start to hear that young people have curiosities about their bodies or about something that's going on in their life, there can be a shutdown because it's, oh no, they should not be doing that. So I do want to say, like, being able to engage in those conversations is a protective factor, is a preventative factor, because then you can start to say, actually, no, you deserve more than that. These are some of the things that would be ideal. And let's figure out if there's another way. And I'll pass the mic.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for this question. I love that we're talking about prevention. I think that's so important. So the commercial sex trade is driven by social inequity and by systems of oppression that we discussed here: racism, classism, sexism. Entry into the sex trade is driven by poverty, homelessness, family violence, childhood sexual abuse, trauma, the list goes on. So New Yorkers can help vulnerable young people by investing in their communities through education, employment, housing programs, and also investing in the youth specifically who are at risk, because deep-seated inequity is integral to the continued exploitation of children. So depending on your role in a young person's life, you might be a teacher, you might be a bus driver, you might be a neighbor, you might be able to identify young people that are at risk based on their vulnerabilities. So things that we discuss: youth that are homeless, histories of running away, involvement in foster care or juvenile justice system, a history of abuse, specifically sexual abuse, as well as youth living in poverty, youth that identify as LGBTQIA, so are disproportionately affected. So I think if someone comes to you, first of all, what you can do is thank them for sharing this information with you, thank them for their bravery, validate their experiences. This is a very difficult thing to talk about. And also providing trauma-informed care to survivors means recognizing that survivors are more than their experiences of a commercial sex, and that each survivor is unique and has unique needs. So you can ask the survivor, what are your current needs and how can I help you? And a lot of times that might mean connecting them to resources in New York City. There are so many resources available to survivors, and we are part of different agencies that provide those resources. So that is just a wonderful key and a wonderful way to help a survivor who comes to you.
Can you talk a little bit more about what resources are available, both in the Bronx and sort of across the city?
Sure. So I can start, and then I think Michelle might have something to add. All of us here are, like I said, working at various agencies that provide services. I'd like to just note 3 specific programs at Sanctuary for Families that work specifically with survivors. And one of them being the Justice and Empowerment for Teens initiative, which is the JET initiative that I mentioned earlier that I lead. It's a clinical program for minor survivors of sex and labor trafficking. So we provide culturally informed, trauma-informed services to survivors, counseling, case management groups, the whole deal. And I also want to mention the Empower Center. The Empower Center was launched in 2020, and it's a multidisciplinary program that co-locates medical, mental health, legal, and social services. And actually, it it's a collaborative program between health and hospitals and Sanctuary for Families, and they're located at Gouverneur Hospital, but recently they expanded to Jacoby Hospital in the Bronx. So their psychological and GYN services are also available in the Bronx at Jacoby. And I'd also like to mention the Anti-Trafficking Initiative, or ATI, which is in our legal department at Sanctuary for Families, and they offer legal services as well as mental health services to trafficking survivors of all ages. And all this information is available on our website if you want to check it out further.
Michelle, did you want to add?
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I'm so grateful to be here with all of these other advocates. We run a program alongside STEPS, Just Us, which is for young people who have experienced systems. And it's a gender expansive program, knowing and recognizing that a lot of young people who have been impacted by the juvenile legal system and other systems have also experienced some level of sexual violence. And so that is available to folks. It's Just Us, and it's in partnership with the Administration for Children's Services and STEPS. And we also run Sisters in Strength, which is a circle model where we are working with survivors of child sexual abuse and sexual violence who are taking their power back and figuring out ways and doing community organizing to name these things within the community and the world, and really seeking healing through that process. So I think there are the emergency strategies that you need right in that moment, which I think is also really specific when you're thinking about young people. There's like this thing that happens right away. You want to listen, and then there's also some urgent things that have to happen, or things that you want to do to protect. And then there's a longer term. What do I do after action's been taken, potentially legal action, other methods that I want to do to address this within my community and ensure this doesn't happen to other young people in my community.
Great, thank you. Reverend Q, can you expand a little more about what red flags indicators we should be looking at, if looking out for, so that we can make sure that we, can identify people who might be being trafficked, and if there are particular businesses or industries that we should be aware of that sort of where this happens more often?
Yeah, I'm hoping that there's some parents on the line as well, because I think it's very important that we know what our kids are doing and our children are doing, because really, when we look at this space, a lot of the stuff is happening in our social media piece, right? And so it's important that if we start seeing adult boyfriends on the phone, or all of a sudden, they were leaving the house looking one way and coming back with more expensive clothing, etc. Now, while we're saying these different signs, red flags, not everything is going to be a traffic case. However, with these signs, you've got to know something is wrong, right? So if they're always on their phone and refuse to take breaks, some sleep with their phones, they're not coming home at night, coming home in different clothes than what when they left. Wearing clothes you didn't buy them. New tattoos. When you think about tattoos, yes, there's a whole world of tattoos, a whole world of emojis, and that's a whole nother conversation. We do extensive training in that, not on my watch. It can be cherries, roses, dollar signs, crowns, using words that are indicative of the life, right? Such as finessing, getting a telly, a hotel, baddie, wifey, out of pocket, etc. We do extensive training in that. But you've got to start paying attention. But if you're not educated, you're not going to know what to look for. And so the real key for me is our parents, our guardians, our schools, everyone, every corner of our city needs to be educated. You'll find even the change in their fashion may be more provocative. That's a very quoted word. A sudden negative change in their grades, always exhausted. Excessive crying or depression. Again, these things may point to trafficking and it may point to something else, but no matter what, you got to recognize that something is wrong. They'll find themselves acting secretive, defensive to questions, unable to say where they've been. They don't disclose information about who their friends are. They have a hard time looking at you in the eyes, right? And a lot of adults, and you do not know them on their social media platform. And let me just give you a real quick personal piece. One of my survivor leaders of our organization is the only people of color organization in New York combating human trafficking and domestic violence through education and training, community and policy advocacy, the only. So my survivor trainer, my survivor leader, she herself had a daughter in the Bronx that was trafficked at 12 years old, and she was recruited by a classmate in the Bronx of a school, and the trafficker was the mother. So during that time, that's what she was noticing. The daughter would leave, she'd be gone for days in, would come back, clothes all tattered, unwashed, and so these became, she became very concerned about what was happening. But if she didn't dive into knowing the signs, she would have never known what was really happening to her daughter. And the end of the story is a good story. She was able to walk into the house where her daughter was being trafficked in the back room while she was completely made up, and actually walked her out. And that story ended. And unfortunately, back then, we did not have the laws we have right now, where the 12 or 13 years old was forced to testify. Her mother wasn't going to subject her to it. Right before I continue, Megan, can I please give a shout out to AG Latisha James? I did not do that in my opening, and that's very important. Thank you for coming to the Bronx, AG. And I have to shout out my amazing Darcel Clark and my Bronx Borough president. And they may or may not still be on the line, but I do have to give them their due diligence in that. So that's what you're going to see. You may see certain poor hygiene, odors that are maybe indicative of an STI. Someone else is controlling their movements, communicating with other friends, and they're no longer going out with their friends, right? So sex trafficking is a complex crime, but many of the indicators are not. So this is not an exhaustive list, but once you understand how these predators operate and the common acts associated with this crime, you increase your chances of identifying trafficking and being able to properly report it. And that is why at Not On My Watch, we do provide this training. In my last statement, I know we have to go on, we were doing a training in one of the houses of worship, because we trained houses of worship. We trained in Cornell Hospital. We've been in schools everywhere. When we were in the one house of worship, there was someone that just screamed to the top of her lungs and way in the back of the sanctuary. Why? Because when we begin to break down some of the things that have been happening on Facebook and some of the terminology, it was then she realized that her family members were involved. So you do need to know the red flags. You do need to know the indicators. You do need to be educated. And where is it happening? It's happening everywhere, right? It's happening in our shelters, our foster care system, where there are vulnerable girls and boys. It's happening in our schools. I don't think we can pinpoint, but we can say there are common places. I mean, in events like the Super Bowl, at hotels, it's happening, through our massage parlors and strip clubs. It's happening what's called trap houses, one way in and one way out. It's happening next door, your next door neighbor, because it is occurring in NYCHA housing. So don't think that it's not happening in your neck of the woods. Sorry, it took a long time, but I just was very full.
That's okay. I appreciate what you're saying. So Michelle, maybe turn to you, pulling in a question from the audience is sort of how have things changed during the pandemic? And then others can add in too.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic has been impactful. I think what we're seeing across is that there's an increase in young people naming that they are experiencing, first of all, a lack of resources, right? We know that this is what our communities are experiencing, in addition to already having being impacted prior to COVID-19. And so now we're also hearing that there's more, they're in the home, where maybe before they could go or leave or get to other places, having to be there, and then also having to find new ways to support family members, or they're caregiving for more folks. So already being impacted, and then now seeing this. And one of the things that I've talked about with my colleagues at different organizations, especially thinking through folks who are doing services with high school age students, is that we're just hearing more about the level of frustration and not knowing how to connect to resources or where to go at this time. Because before it was easier to walk into a place or go with a friend somewhere. And so I do really think, because I know that a lot of the folks who are on the line have reopened, have always been available via phone and doing what it takes to get done. Like advocates who are on this line are the ones who are, in the community constantly doing this. And there are folks who have constantly still been going door to door. So right now we're seeing an increase in numbers more than ever with young people reporting. And when I say reporting, I mean reporting different forms of harm. So I don't want to just put it into the sex trafficking bucket. We're seeing a large amount of increase in intimate partner violence, which we can't always separate out from knowing that there is the coercion. There are people who are older who are in relationships with younger people. So just naming that, and I'll pass the mic.
Great, thank you. And Tiana, could you speak a little bit about if someone does suspect trafficking, what should they do? And I guess in the same, what should people be cautioned against doing?
Well, I think that my co-panelists who are direct service providers, I have to say, the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women is probably the only non-provider on this call. So, we're primarily a legal advocacy and we're raising awareness organization. But I think what was striking about the Alexander case is that it happened, as it was mentioned, it happened in broad daylight, in a building, in a residential building. There were testimonies of neighbors who came down. There was one testimony of a mother who came down with a baseball bat and said, "Don't touch my daughters," etc. So it's first of all, if we don't know what sex trafficking is, or if we don't know what the mechanics are, that again, it is a market, it's very hard for the average person to identify it. And it's certainly dangerous to get involved. I would say, if you think there's a trafficking situation, do not get involved yourself. There are hotlines. Some people question the validity of those hotlines, or whether they go anywhere. There's the local police, obviously. If you think, I was reading that, I was wondering, like, what would I have done? And I've been working on this for 30 years, and what would I have done, and who would have believed me that my neighbor was trafficking young girls, or that you saw men come and purchase them? It's a very, very difficult, it's very difficult from an individual perspective. I think what is needed is really investment from our city, our state, our municipalities, our New York City Council, to really start a robust education program that has teeth, and really that, and on the one hand, it's also important to, how do you, there's the whole cultural push of accepting things that you see that probably are commercial sexual exploitation, but you just think, you put the blame on the girl or on the person who is being exploited. So I would say, call your local representative, your state representative, and ask them to invest in agencies such as the ones that are represented here, to really have a comprehensive, trauma-informed, and also a network of information that the average person can go to if they suspect that something is happening.
Thank you so much. So as some of you have touched on, the Attorney General's, the case against Paul Alexander was really possible because of a new law, right, that deems sex trafficking a child a felony. Other changes needed in the law to help prevent and stop sex trafficking? And maybe Anita and Anne, if you could respond to that.
Sure, thank you. And I do want to commend the New York State Legislature for recently repealing loitering for the purposes of prostitution. I think a lot of us supported repeal of that bill, and that whenever you have any type of legislation or systems that continue to criminalize and create carceral pathways for those who are already victims of crime, it just exacerbates their vulnerability to being re-victimized or re-trafficked, regardless of what their original situation was. And so repeal of loitering for the purposes of prostitution was a huge step forward, and we're really grateful for that within the advocate community. I think also in terms of changes in the law that would increase access to services, this is also a bill that many of us, if not all of us on this panel support, but it's the START Act. It's Survivors of Trafficking Attaining Relief Together. And I can drop the bill numbers in the chat. But this is a bill that would vacate all types of criminal convictions for human trafficking survivors for crimes that their traffickers forced them to commit. This has passed the Assembly every year for the last few years. It's never passed the Senate. We are the closest we've ever been for this to pass the Senate, and we have been engaging in multiple coalition meetings with Assembly members and different senators. We've had a teach-in, we've had survivors speak out on the issue, including those who have lived experience. And so the START Act, by vacating the criminal convictions, and it's not an automatic vacature, the individual still has to file a motion and has to be found a victim of human trafficking, and they still have to plead their motion in court. And it can still be opposed by the prosecutor depending on the particular circumstances of the case, and it's up to judicial discretion. So it's not by any means an automatic vacature of these criminal convictions. But by allowing a pathway for criminal record relief for human trafficked survivors, you allow them to go forward and enroll in school and to obtain employment in a plethora of different industries. We have individuals who have criminal records that they can't vacate. And so when they apply for new jobs, it comes up in their background check and they're shut out of working in those industries. So if we're talking about the root causes of why individuals are susceptible to trafficking and to being re-trafficked, if we don't change the systems that have incarcerated the victims in the first place, then we will never give them a way to give themselves a step up, to create a new life and to start over. And if that means enrolling in new educational opportunities and seeking new employment opportunities, these are all things that will help stabilize an individual. And it's things that our clients have told us would make a massive improvement in their lives immediately. So that's a plug for that. And I will drop the bill numbers in the chat, as I mentioned. Thank you.
And just to follow up on what Anita was talking about, I think not only do we all have to work collectively for the passage of things like the START Act, but we absolutely need to monitor the implementation of any shifts in law or shifts in policy. I mean, we are at a period of rapid and in some ways radical transformation of the criminal legal system, led by people like Attorney General James and District Attorney Clark. And while that we have seen a steady decrease in the arrest of survivors of gender-based violence, including survivors of trafficking who are now have been coerced into facilitating trafficking, we haven't seen the complete elimination of those arrests. At Steps, for the past 30 years, we've been running a criminalized survivors program that supports survivors of gender-based violence who have been arrested for their efforts to survive. And that is, and we are still seeing every day survivors of gender-based violence in New York City being arrested for their attempts to keep themselves and their families alive. As an example, today I was in conversation with other alternatives to incarceration providers. We at Steps are an alternatives to incarceration provider who supports criminalized survivors of gender-based violence. And while all other alternatives to incarceration providers are seeing a slowdown in their referrals, we are seeing an increase in our referrals because we know that the pandemic has intensified the harm that people who harm their intimate partner cause. We've seen an increase in intimate partner violence survivorship and other forms of gender-based violence. And when we see an intensification of gender-based violence, we see an increase in the need for survivors to use survival violence or other form or coerced into engaging a behavior that is defined as criminalized. So we're seeing a steady stream of survivors continuing to be arrested. This is primarily happening in the adult criminal legal system. So I think that we are focusing here on young people. We're not seeing it at the same rates, and we're not seeing it spread out evenly across all boroughs. So thanks goes to DA Clark and her office. But we absolutely need to we can't lose focus on, although there are policies across New York City that are committed to not arresting survivors of gender-based violence, survivors of gender-based violence are still getting arrested. So we know, and as everyone has mentioned here, when a survivor of gender-based violence is arrested, the harm of that arrest and everything that comes after that is pretty tremendous, because we know that the the nature of the arrest to arraignment to prosecution and sometimes detainment at Rikers Island process is especially harmful to survivors of trauma because it's a system that minimizes choice and agency. And survivors of gender-based violence constantly survive in relationship where there is no choice and agency. So it's just an exacerbation of all of their trauma symptoms. And we know that when survivors of gender-based violence are arrested, their trauma symptoms are actively triggered and intensified and worsened by their arrest. So in addition to fighting for the passage of new law, we need to keep our eyes on the laws that already exist and just do whatever we can to ensure that survivors of gender-based violence are themselves not getting arrested.
Thank you. And Reverend Q, in addition to these legal changes and, making sure our current existing legal laws are enforced, what else can we do to spread awareness and ensure that the rights of people are protected?
Thank you for that question. I do want to wrap in as I lead into that answer that I think everyone on this line or those that are listening understand that this is not just a third world country issue, right? So it's right in our backyard. And in 2019, we had over NYPD reported over 3,000 children subjected to sex trafficking in New York City, not in the state, in the city. And then the next point I think is very important is that a lot of us think that, human trafficking victims are always kidnapped. Right? And this is not the movie Taken. That's not our playbook, right? They're mainly trafficked by strangers, what people think. But they, in many cases, they know their victims. And as I mentioned earlier, tend to build trust over time. And so when I think about what we need to do further is education. As I said earlier, education, education, and education. Keep opening these doors for awareness education. And through this, and those that are listening or watching, don't play Superman. This isn't a rescue mission, it's a safety mission. And the way we assure safety is to build trust, build relationship, because they're not going to listen to you unless they trust you. So we have to be patient. You're not there to put an expiration date on their trauma. You're there to walk them through it. So even if they relapse, we have to be there for them. And we can't give up. We can never give up on our quote unquote children. And that's why we have to build that support system within the family, recognizing they too are victims. We at None of My Watch, we have a parent survivor advocacy support group that meet because we recognize that not only do the children suffer in this mental space, PTSD, so do their parents. And so we have to know how to build that support system. So who needs to be at the table? Everyone needs to be at the table to help identify. Not everyone needs to create the intervention. Some of our role is simply to pick up a phone, send an email, but everyone needs to be able to help to identify because this is about neighbor being restored into our hoods and being the village that once again raises its children. A lot of times we've turned a blind eye to what's been happening right under our nose because we're so busy with life. But unless we start paying more attention to this, we're going to lose more. Schools need to be at the forefront in training. We need more resources, more dollars. When I say resources, more dollars to come in. We want to expand our training programs. Curriculum need to be mandated in this area as in our schools. So for me, not one corner of our city needs to be exempt from education. They said shelter training needs to be mandated, it needs to be implemented. And so we all have a role to play from NYPD to the mama waiting to catch the bus. So we need to use the hotlines that's available in the city that protects you, the caller. So save it in your phone so that if you see something, yes, we are responsible to say something.
So unfortunately, we're out of time, and I want to thank all of our panelists for joining in this conversation this evening. I think, we really appreciate the information and the discussion this evening, and then, of course, all the work that you all do every day, and look forward to collaborating with you sort of moving forward. And now I'd like to turn it over to Attorney General James to close us out.
Thank you, Megan, for hosting this evening's discussion. I want to thank all of the panelists, all of my advocates, and all of my allies in the struggle to protect women and young individuals and individuals who have been traumatized based on their gender. And I truly want to thank the interpreters who are here today. Let me thank Priscilla Tavares from my office. I want to thank the Bronx District Attorney, Ruben Diaz Jr., as well as the Bronx District Attorney, Darcel Clark, and Councilwoman Vanessa Gibson and Ty Johnson for all of your assistance this evening. And thank all of you for recognizing that this is not just happening in the Bronx. We wanted to highlight one particular case involving Mr. Paul Alexander, but this is happening in New York City, all over New York City. And it's happening in the daytime and it's happening in the evenings. I saw it in Brooklyn as a city council member, as a public advocate, and now as a statewide attorney general. Young people are being trafficked in every corner of our city and even our state. There was a report recently from the New York Women's Foundation that said that more than 4,000 underage youth are victims of sex. But I would argue that number is underreported because most individuals do not underreport these types of offenses and crimes. It is notoriously underreported, but it's really up to all of us on this call, all of us who care about one another, all of us who recognize that we're inextricably tied to one another and we've got a responsibility and a duty. And I particularly want to thank Anna Thomas for what she said. And that is, we've got to meet these young women where they are. And we have to recognize the inequities that continue to exist, the structural inequities that continue to exist, systematic inequities, the racism that exists. And we've got to build trust and be on the ground and not in white ivory towers. And that is why politics matter. I know a lot of young sisters who I've met throughout my life and during my career who were trafficked. They came to my office as a city council member. They approached me in my neighborhood. They still approach me. And it's important that they have someone that they can trust and someone who they can confide in, and someone who obviously will continue to educate the general public with regards to trafficking that continues to exist, that we educate individuals, we empower these young ladies and young men, and that we provide them with the services that they so desperately need, and we circle them, as part of the human family. So I thank all of you. We've got a lot of work to do, as Ann said, and as Anita said, and as Reverend English said, and as Tiana said, we've got a lot of work to do. I want to thank Michelle for her inspiring remarks and her kind words, and know that we are all in this together. In the meantime, we will again prosecute Mr. Alexander to the fullest extent of the law, along with the district attorney. And this is a warning shot to all of those individuals who would traffic young girls, that our eyes are out there, and that our eyes again expand. Let us continue to be in this space and continue to expand this conversation. But most importantly, let's keep these young people safe. Thank you all. I'll talk to you soon.